Good morning, friends. My name is Darren St. George, and welcome to another Monday morning program with Sal. If you've been with us before, welcome back. It's always a pleasure to see you. If this is your first time, welcome to the party. This is how we start each and every week, celebrating entertainment's leaders, legends, and icons, and this morning is, of course, no exception. We are heading to the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming, once again, one of our favorite stops, and we're joined with a longtime friend, Kirsten Michael, our exclusive tours coordinator. She'll also be joined by Nick today, who'll be running our camera. If you have any questions, we'd love to hear them. Please share them in the chat, and I'll happily relay those over to the team, as well as Sal. And speaking of Sal, let's get to the man of the hour. Sal, Dad, are you there?
And I see Kirsten and Nick are already on board.
There we go. We're off to the races.
Yeah, and this is the first of a series of programs that we're doing for the first time this year. What we're doing basically is visiting with old friends for the holidays. And the reason we went back to the Buffalo Bill Center, they were one of the very first to join us when we began this 4 years ago. I can't believe it's 4 years ago.
Yep.
And they were so kind to open up their doors for us. And you got to remember, that was a time when the pandemic was at its peak. So they encouraged us to keep on going with this program. And here we are 4 years later, still visiting with all these museums around the world. And I'm so glad we're going back to Wyoming.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's get Kirsten and Nick in, because I think we're seeing something we've never seen before.
And unfortunately, we're also fighting with the Wyoming state, which is pretty classic, honestly. So if you can't hear me, let me know. And our lovely leaf blower is also going. It's perfectly timed. It always is. But we decided to bring you outside because what a lot of people don't realize at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West is that we have 40 acres of outdoor space, including sculpture gardens and nature trails. And one of our largest artifact in the entire collection of the Center of the West is actually outside, and it is Buffalo Bill's boyhood home. So we figured we would start there, and then we'll bring you inside and feature some of our temporary exhibits, and then we'll see where the curiosity brings us.
Sounds great.
Okay. That's wonderful. And I think it's important to point out she identified his home as an artifact. It's an object in your collection. Is that correct? Oh, you tapped the mute button by accident. You can go ahead and unmute yourself there.
Yes, this is officially an artifact in the Buffalo Bill Center of the West collection. So the whole Center of the West has about 100,000 artifacts, as small as teeny tiny glass beads in our Plains Indian collection, and as large as literally a house. And so this yellow clapboard house actually not only is an artifact in our museum, but it is Buffalo Bill or William F. Cody's boyhood home. And if any of you guys actually know Buffalo Bill history, you'll know that Cody was not actually born in Wyoming. So the great question is, why the heck do we have his boyhood home here? And that is because it was one of the first tourist attractions here in Cody. The railroad was coming through, and they built a depot outside of town, and they wanted something that would appeal to people and keep people in town. So the railroad company actually went and purchased this 2-story clapboard house from LeClaire, Iowa, where it actually was originally built in 1841 along the Mississippi River. And they put it on a railroad bed and literally trained it out here in the 1930s. So this house was built in 1841. Buffalo Bill, William F. Cody, or Little Willie, as he would have been called, would have been in this house and born in this house, pretty much. So this is a really interesting connection to our namesake, Buffalo Bill. It's an interesting connection to the history of structures and houses in the West, including Wyoming, because technically it is the oldest standing structure in all of Wyoming, which sounds really odd. It's only about 180 years old, which for y'all folks who are out on the East Coast, 180 is not that old. But for Wyoming, a structure with 4 walls, windows, and a roof, still standing today that you can walk into, 180 is the oldest structure in Wyoming, which really didn't see settlers coming out until the mid-1800s. But so this yellow house, it was painted. We had match or paint chips that were analyzed to see what color the house originally was. And apparently it was this pale yellow. So we restored the paint color, we restored the windows, and then you can see there's a little picket fence to the left. Apparently that's what protected the Cody's family vegetable garden from the deer. So it's the largest artifact, the oldest house, and it's our namesake's home. And the reason we also wanted to feature it is because this museum, I go in front of the camera. So this house behind me is 2 full stories. The family would have lived upstairs, and we're talking not a small family. We're talking there was like 5 kids and 2 adults and a few dogs running around. And William Cody was just one of those 5 kids. He was the second oldest boy, and then he had several sisters. And they would all live and sleep upstairs in the upper bedroom. And the reason why we're connecting this to kind of a ski season is because, unfortunately for little Willie Cody, he lived on the frontier, which means he had to deal with some frontier tragedies, including the loss of his older brother, Sam. Sam was killed in a horseback riding accident when little Cody was only about 6 years old. And so this was the house that they originally would have been living in at the time of the accident. And unfortunately, Sam's ghost kind of chased the family out. Not so literally where the ghost was like trying to get them to leave, but the loss of the son, Cody suddenly becoming the oldest child, the loss of a child really affects the family. So this house, though, it's interesting because Cody spent the rest of his 70 years of life kind of running from ghosts, running from tragedy in the Wild West, whether it was his friends, his questionable business decisions, or literally some tragic loss and ghosts of his friends and family. And it's funny to think that ultimately even the house where his brother would die would follow him out to Wyoming. So Buffalo Bill was kind of haunted by a few ghosts. Despite that, he would become one of the most famous celebrities in the world. And part of that reason is just because of his promotional material, his marketing materials. You've all seen the movie posters from the 1950s and 60s. Well, Buffalo Bill was the guy who kind of started that trend with the big posters that would go on the side of the boards or billboards and buildings. So
Kirsten, may I interrupt you for a second? When the guests,
go for it.
When guests come to your museum, are they allowed inside the house?
Yes. So we can go inside. The problem with us walking you into it is that we totally lose connection.
Yeah, I know. I didn't expect that we could get in there, but I was wondering that people are probably wondering, can we go inside?
Yes, you can walk inside. You can see what was originally the living room, sitting room, parlor area, and then also their kitchen area. So this was officially a 4-room cabin, 4-room house, which was pretty darn big. And they would have actually built a lean-to on the back of the house, which is where they would have cooked and had their cooking fires and their stoves and whatnot. So you can go in if you ever come in. You can also enjoy our garden space. Maybe not right now. It's a little windy and chilly. But we do have sculpture gardens as well throughout the area.
Okay, and when you say they would have built a lean-to on the backside of the house, they'd be cooking outside.
Yes. So they would not normally be cooking inside this house specifically. The lean-to would have been where they kept a lot of the food storage, where they would have had the main cooking stove and fire. They would have done some food prep in the living room or even outside on nice days. But that lean-to helped keep that mess a little separate from the living areas.
Yeah, I know a lot of times when you visit historic homes, they will bring you into these extravagant kitchens and show you the stoves and all of the cooking ware. But really, I think it was a lot more informal at that time. You would have been cooking outside because fire is hot and dangerous, and it's far more convenient to be cooking in your backyard rather than trying to confine yourself to a kitchen space.
Exactly. And the family they'd have their main cooking stove in the lean-to, and then they'd have 2 smaller wood stoves. They would be on either side of the building, and they would have chimneys that went up. You can see the chimneys at the top of the ceiling. So those chimneys would go up on both sides of the house, and that would help warm the whole house. So despite the lack of insulation and the questionably thin walls of this house, it actually was relatively warm. At least it was good enough for a family of 6 on the edge of the Mississippi River back in the 1840s. Wow. I don't want to live here, but it is cool to visit.
Kirsten, we have a question. Do you have any pre-recordings or any tours that you've done inside the house that we could share with the guests in a follow-up email?
That is a good question. I do not, as the exclusive tours coordinator. I could always check with our educational department.
Yeah.
And that is something that I want to pursue just because there is a whole upper level, but you're not actually allowed to go into the upper level if you visit us. You can just walk through and look into the main level and look around the or look around the house.
Because
So
of safety concerns.
Yes. I mean, a 180-year-old house that's been moved 4 times in its life. It's some structural questions. But we try and make it so it's restored and stable enough so people can walk in at least that first level. But that is something I really want to do in the future, is to be able to get a camera upstairs, because I don't even know what it looks like.
You know, Kirsten, we've been to your facility so many times. I remember visiting you, and there was a huge snowstorm outside. Now
Yeah.
we're getting to see the change of colors on the trees, and it looks beautiful in your area.
Yes, fall. We are at the height of fall, although it's actually a lot warmer than it has been. We're at the end of October already. Usually we have snow on the mountains, and we haven't gotten a lot right now, but that does mean our fall colors have lasted a lot longer, which I'm a Midwest girl originally, so I like the fall colors. Although, again, from the Northeast, you guys have fall colors that would blow us away. And it is really nice to be able to showcase that difference in weather. Yeah, one of the first ones we did, it was blizzarding outside.
Yeah. If Nick could pivot the camera just a little bit to the right to see that tree there. Look at that. It's beautiful. Very nice.
Yeah.
We're nature lovers here.
Well, good. Then you would love visiting us here at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, because we have about 32 acres of pristine sagebrush nature trails, which bring you all the way down to our Shoshone River. And the geology is amazing. I don't know if anybody likes rocks. I like rocks. I can talk about rocks forever. And then, of course, our plants and the animals. We are literally in the Wild West, despite being of town. We have bears and deer and all kinds of stuff that come this close to town. So if you like nature, not only do we have history, but we got a lot of nature for there, too.
Okay. Are we going to go inside now?
Yes. So to make sure people don't get motion sickness, Nick is going to turn off the camera, and we're going to head inside and go down to our temporary exhibit space, which currently features the poster art and promotional marketing materials of Buffalo Bill. Sound good?
Sounds great. Yeah.
Okay.
Again, something new from Kirsten.
And I like this idea, Pop. That's pretty smart to be turning off the camera in between these transitions.
Oh,
wow. Yeah, maybe we should be considering that, because it does get a little shaky as you're walking holding a camera. Question here: are there any buffalo on the property?
We'll find that out.
Yeah.
You had a little bit of an experience with a bison.
I did years ago. My wife and I, we were driving through Yellowstone, and there was this big pasture, and at the bottom of the pasture was a river. And on the other side of the river was a herd of bison. And we're like, this is beautiful. We had just gotten a new video camera, thought we'd go try it, and the two of us headed out there. And we stayed a respectful distance on the safe side of the river. We took about 5 minutes of footage. And then we're like, all right, let's head back to the car. And when we turned around, that pasture that was previously empty and barren was now full of a bison herd that had come in behind us. So we had a herd on the other side of the river facing us, and we had a herd behind us between ourselves and our car. And we slowly just had to, we walked for a quarter of a mile, half a mile, whatever it took, parallel to the herd until we were ahead of them and could get back to safety. But you have to be very careful. There are signs everywhere, and there are lots of concerns for those types of things in Yellowstone for good reason.
Okay.
And so to answer your question, we do not have any buffalo on the property, although we do have a herd just up the North Fork of the Shoshone River from us. So you can be less than 15 miles from town and seeing buffalo. They haven't gotten quite over the nearest mountain, but we do have 13 birds of prey. We have a raptor program here they were injured in the wild and are unreleasable. So they live here as educational ambassadors. So we do have some wildlife that's actually part of the system, but no buffalo yet.
Pop, that's one of your favorites, birds of prey.
Oh, yeah. From many moons ago, I was writing shows for Disney and Busch Gardens, and they were bird shows. And that's when I began to fall in love with the birds. but we worked with a lot of birds of prey, whether it was vultures or eagles or whatever. Yeah, I loved it. Hawks.
Well, very cool. Yeah. I mean, it's not famous celebrities, although we do have some birds named after famous people. But if you ever want to visit the Muse, we probably could arrange that too. We're the institution that just keeps on giving.
It's unbelievable. It really is every time. All right, so what are we looking?
Okay, hold on one second.
Yeah.
Last week I do quite a bit of lecturing, and Long Island University is a big school here on Long Island, and I was talking about going to celebrity museums and that we were coming to your location, and a gentleman raised his hand, and he said he had visited your establishment. And he said, my biggest disappointment is we stopped there simply because we were passing through Wyoming and we saw the sign and we thought, whoa, let's go check it out. His biggest disappointment about the museum, they only had 3 hours. And we've been with you at least 7 hours and we still haven't seen everything. So he was disappointed and he wants to go back again to your location because he felt that they missed so much.
We get that response a lot from people who come through our front doors where they don't realize it's 7 acres of indoor space and 5 individual museums plus a research library. And they just come in thinking it's a museum and then their minds are blown. But we're open year round. So if anybody wants to take a winter trip out, it's great. There's like nobody else here and we are open.
Do you have any hotels with the museum or just in the town?
So just with the town, we partner with them if we have like conferences or events going on, but we have no official hotel attached to us, although Buffalo Bill's name is on a few of them, but they're not directly connected to us.
Okay, we're going to get to the poster art in just one second. We have a last question. Are there any Mustangs, horses on the property? I guess what type of wildlife is on the property that we could see?
So we don't have any horses or Mustangs permanently on the property, although given our connection to the Bureau of Land Management and public lands, there are several wild horses and their herds around Cody, Wyoming and around the area that we're currently in. So that's relatively easy to see just driving down the highway. I didn't realize the herd of horses I was looking at the first time was literally a wild horse herd until somebody told me. But wild horses, elk and deer are really common. We're on a lot of migration routes right here. And because of our nature trails, that's some of the pristine migration areas that people can walk through. Keep your distance though. The deer and elk move very fast. And then we also have the occasional mountain lion, which is a little more concerning. Or any small creatures. We have ground squirrels, which are always a lot of fun. So I think prairie dogs, except a little bit smaller. And then any type of mountain bird. I mean, whether you see the boring sparrows or the really interesting woodpeckers, or my favorite is our mountain bluebirds, which you always know when winter is ending is when the bluebirds come back to the sagebrush.
Oh, that's a nice marker. I like that.
Well, thanks. It's my job to be able to weave words together.
You do very well. So what are we looking at here?
Okay, so behind me is one of about 40 posters that we currently have on display that are original promotional materials that Buffalo Bill's Wild West used to promote himself and his show. Buffalo Bill would be the most famous man on earth. We joke about it in the exclusive tours program that Taylor Swift wishes she was as famous as Buffalo Bill was. And she has email and social media and media on her side. Whereas Buffalo Bill, the only real way to communicate his show, to communicate that he was coming to the next town, were these posters. So I'm going to let Nick get a little closer so your audience can see some of the details of these posters. This specific one dates to about 1907, and it does showcase the different acts that you would have seen if you attended Buffalo Bill's Wild West in 1907. Everything from the very traditional cowboys were involved here with their horse skills. You had the women equestrians. Buffalo Bill has featured women in his show pretty much from the very beginning because he knew women had a lot of skills and talent that a lot of other outlets weren't letting them showcase. And he would also pay them really well. So a lot of women would gravitate towards Buffalo Bill's show and people would love it because it was so different. So in 1907, you could see the women's equestrian programs. You could see riding broncos over here. And then you would also, if you get closer, Nick, you can see the different country flags that are all displayed in his arena. And the reason that this poster shows all the different country flags is because Cody not only visited a lot of these countries, but he would host people from these countries. You would have Japanese samurai working with them. You would have Australian Aboriginal folks working with Cody. You'd have Russian Cossacks. So this wasn't just the American Wild West, this was the world's Wild West. Any culture that had a forced culture, Cody wanted to showcase it. So this is just one of those original paper printed. It's ink and paper, over 110 years old. And then so if we want to pivot real quick, we can look at some of the other things that you would have seen if you were advertising. We're seeing advertisements for Buffalo Bill's Wild West.
Kirsten, when people came to see the show, was this like a big top? Was it out in the open? Did he build his own arena?
Yes, to all of those things. So Cody's main arena would be open. You would have roofs over the grandstand seating area so people could sit and watch without being, under the blazing sun or under the rain. But the whole show arena, there wasn't really a roof over it, except in a few instances. They had a big indoor arena for one of their European shows. Otherwise, it was just easier to build the open air arenas because he and his crew of like 600 people would build the show everywhere they went. They would be able to tear it down and put it up in less than a day. And they were so good at it that international military personnel actually studied how Buffalo Bill and his partners moved people and constructed these camps. It was so impressive.
It still is. Wow.
Yes. So I stopped in front of another one of our posters. This is titled Besieged Cowboys. And this dates, actually, this is one of the earliest posters we have. It dates to 1885. So again, I'm a historian, not a mathematician, so somebody else can tell me how many years it's been since 1885. But the fact that we have original paper, ink, and colored images still available to us that showcased how Buffalo Bill promoted his show is really fascinating. The image itself is interesting. One of Cody's original draws for the audiences back east was the cowboys. Cody wasn't necessarily performing out in Wyoming or out in Montana because this is our culture. We didn't really want to pay money to see our backyards. But he realized the Eastern audiences in New York, in Massachusetts, in Washington, D.C., he knew that there was a huge demand for Western news, Western entertainment. So one of his main scenes that he would show people was literally a reenactment of a battle where you have the besieged cowboys, and then in the background you have the Native Americans over here as the aggressors in this sense, which at the time in 1885, that was the American West. There was the pioneers and settlers coming west. You had the Native Americans fighting to defend their freedom and territories. And this is something that Buffalo Bill would bring to the Eastern audiences as almost not even a show, just more as a news report. He was telling people what were going on, and he was bringing people, these cowboys would have been actual cowboys that were in the West that had this experience. So it wasn't just a reenactment like we think today of modern people reenacting something 100 years ago. Cody, the man, was bringing people who were veterans of these battles, who were veterans of the West, bringing them east and showcasing what he considered the authentic West.
Kirsten, was he sensationalizing the Old West? Was he creating what we have learned over the years? And was it real? Was it fictitious? What was it that he was basing it on? Or was he just trying to get an audience into his show?
A little bit of both. So Cody was very much a storyteller in the sense that if anybody out there on screen had, if you have a fisher in your family, a fisherman in your family, and they tell the story of, the first time I caught this fish, it was this big. By the second time they tell a story, the fish is this big. The third time they tell a story, the fish is this big. Cody was similar in that sense, in the way that Cody would be part of these actual battles, live in the West, meet these people. And he was really showing real things that happened. And we know a lot of the things he showed were real because we have military documents, we have newspaper reports, we have photographs, journal entries of these incredible events that were happening out West. But Cody would kind of take it one step farther, and he would make sure that people would be entertained for the hour-long show, because most of these battles, most of these events really didn't last that long. We're talking maybe 20 minutes. And Cody, so he had to kind of stretch that out. He would sensationalize some things. He would focus on different parts of the story at different times in order to draw out the time to keep people's attention on. One of the best examples is the Pony Express relay that he would host in his arena. Most of us have heard of the Pony Express today. It was a mail route that reached from Missouri to California. It only existed for about a year and a half, but Buffalo Bill, or then Willie Cody, participated in it. And for 30 years, he would showcase relays in his Wild West show of the Pony Express. And he would sensationalize, that relay guy going to the next station, finding out the relay station that he was supposed to be done at was burnt out or attacked, or the guy that was supposed to replace him was sick. So he would keep on going. So there was some sensationalizing of it, but most of the base of his show was rooted in actual living cultures and living events, which I think is a really fascinating way to perform the West, I guess you could say.
I'm curious, with trying to understand the truth behind the West, have you, or the museum, have you had any contact with Kevin Costner's pursuit recently of Horizons?
Uh-oh. I see it on her face already.
Yeah, right? You saw that. That was good.
Yeah, so we have not, at least not on my level. I'm sure he's reached out to potentially some of our higher admins and other archival collections. I have never talked to the guy, but the Yellowstone, Longmire, any of those even modern Western shows definitely impact how people see the West today, just as, 70 years ago in again, I'm terrible at math, in the 1950s and 60s, when you had Jimmy Stewart and John Wayne showing those kind of Western experiences. Well, technically, a lot of that stuff happened. Main Street shootouts did happen. Cody, we even had a Main Street shootout after a bank robbery. But Hollywood's going to sensationalize. Kevin Costner, Craig Johnson, the author of Longmire, are going to create a story around these things. Buffalo Bill just happened to be one of the early guys who capitalized on this idea of, if we talk about the West, if we tell the West, which is colorful and diverse and kind of chaotic and fascinating all on its own, and if we put some effort into the story making, suddenly it's something that people will pay tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to see and continue. So can't say we've talked to Kevin Costner today, but we're always available.
Okay. When we see him, we'll mention your name. We'll share your info.
Okay, sounds great.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
No problem. Least we could do.
Yeah. Any other questions before we move on to the some other posters in the exhibit?
No, but the poster was illustrated 139 years ago.
Cool. That's somebody you can do.
There we go.
So, let's go this way. There's so many different directions we could go, and we only have a finite amount of time. So I figured I would feature one of the most popular parts of Buffalo Bill's Wild West was Annie Oakley. So Annie Oakley has her own museum back east, but she does have some artifacts with us because of her 17 years that she worked with Buffalo Bill. And she had her own show going on before she even joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West in 1885. Her husband and her traveled the country doing shooting exhibitions, and she was so popular that Buffalo Bill actually heard of her and decided to go ask her to join him, which I think is a really fascinating thing. He went to her and her husband asking, hey, you are so popular, you draw crowds of hundreds of people. If you join me, we can combine our efforts and become one of the most famous Wild West shows in the world. And luckily for Buffalo Bill, Annie Oakley and her husband, Frank Butler, said, yes, let's do it. So Annie Oakley traveled with Buffalo Bill for 17 years, starting in 1885 all the way up to 1902. And interesting enough, she never signed a contract with him, because Cody was kind of the guy, you shake hands on it, and that was it. That was the deal to him, and he would keep his word. And so Annie Oakley appreciated that, and you can see her displayed here. This is an 1890 poster. You can see her medals that she would win from all of the shooting exhibitions. Very few of her medals actually survive today, because she would take a lot of her medals in the World War I era, actually melt them down, sell the resources, and give it to charity, because she wanted to contribute to the World War I efforts. So very few.
Person, do you know how she was compensated by Cody?
Oh, yes, she was paid. She was the second highest paid performer in Buffalo Bill's Wild West.
Okay, so that begs the question, who's number one?
His name is everywhere. That would be Buffalo Bill.
He paid himself. Okay. He paid himself as a performer as well as a producer, as the owner?
Yeah, so Cody would own the Buffalo Bills Wild West, of course. He would have several investors. He would have several business partners to help him run the show kind of behind the scenes. But then Buffalo Bill would be a performer himself. He would do shooting exhibitions. He would, of course, be front and center in a lot of those battle reenactments that he would pull from his own lived experiences, put them in his arena, and people ate it up. That's really how Buffalo Bill became famous first, is because people would write plays about Cody, about Buffalo Bill's exploits in the West. Buffalo Bill the man would end up watching these plays when he was back east, and people would find out that he was in the audience and just would lose their minds, because it was like watching, if Brad Pitt was watching a Brad Pitt movie and you realized he was sitting next to you. That's kind of what happened in the 1870s, where people realized Cody was in the audience of a Buffalo Bill play. They wanted him to stand up and tell stories and speak. Unfortunately, he had terrible stage fright, which is a factoid that not a lot of people realize. Cody was terrible at public speaking for a long, long time before he finally got into the hang of things. But he realized that if people would go crazy for him just sitting in the audience, what would happen if he went on stage and actually did perform? What happens is that they sell out theaters every single night and bring in hundreds of thousands of dollars in a month. The next step is to not only just have the stage play on a stage, actually, but to bring it outside in those open arenas so you can have 10,000 people watching you. So Cody would always kind of stay in the center of the stage, in the limelight, as both a producer, investor, businessman, but also especially as a performer, because that's really what he liked to do. He wanted to be the cowboy frontiersman, because that's really who he was at his roots, was that cowboy frontiersman. So he never wanted to lose that.
And how long was he on the road? Did he have a schedule that would encompass an entire year, or would he take 6 months and then stop? Or how did he schedule himself?
So early on in the 1870s, when he was doing the stage plays, he would go east in the winter. So think October through April, and he would be doing things out east on the stage for production and shows. After April came around, the summer season started out west, so he would go back and he would be an active military scout at the same time that he was kind of doing this stage play thing. When his show starts in 1883, he has retired from being a scout, but there's still a season of showing, because this is, again, before airplanes are a thing, before cars are a thing. This is still the Wild West era, before radio even really is a thing. So Cody knows there's a finite amount of months that you can use in the year for easy travel, good weather for an outdoor show, for moving massive amounts of people. So Cody would really stick to a 6-month-ish show schedule from maybe early May until the end of October, which is really where he was moving around and putting up the show. After that, they would put everything in storage. He would either go off hunting, go off scouting, go off hosting people, and then they would all reconvene the next spring. So he would take some time off, which was a very long-winded answer.
No, it was perfect. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions, or can we move on?
We do have a question. Who illustrated the posters?
Ooh, that is a good question. We very rarely have an actual author's name. What we will have is a company name. So a lot of different printing companies, whether it was the Calhoun Printing Company, which you can see, right? It's kind of hard to see. There's the printing company right there, A. Hone and Co., Baltimore, USA, or there's a poster right to your left, Nick, that showcases a lot of the different firms that Buffalo Bill's marketing team would work with. So they would contract with individual companies who would have their own illustrators to create the show posters, print them. So we don't really know authors, unfortunately. We just know the companies that would employ the original illustrators. So good question.
Yeah,
good timing of the question.
And a good answer also. Yeah.
Okay. So let's look at some international posters, if you're good with that. We'll go over here. Okay, so Cody not only performed for American audiences on the East Coast mostly, but he would get as far west as California and Utah and Colorado and things like that. But he would also take his show on the road. He would go to Europe 3 times, 4 times, at least 3 times. I always mix up how many times he went over to Europe. And he would stay there for years at a time, which was great for the wife, not so much, who would be staying at the ranch and taking care of the property and their kids. But Cody would be a businessman. He would be over in England. He would be over in France. He'd go to Italy. And he was really interesting in the sense that he would adapt his show to the audiences and the cultures that he was talking to. One of the easiest things to do was he would take what was an English poster of the Buffalo Bill Wild West, like this poster right here that is William F. Cody's face in the middle of a buffalo, because it's classic. And this is one of the later posters. This is from about 1900, 1905.
And he didn't even have to put his name on it.
Correct. He was so famous. All he had to do is pretty much say, "I am coming," because people would recognize his face, which is, like I said, Taylor Swift wished she was this famous.
You touched on something, and I'm going to have to interrupt you. I know there's people already. You mentioned about his wife and kids. Just give us a bullet point. We don't have to go into the whole history.
Okay, so Buffalo Bill, very handsome, very charismatic, would get married at the age of 19 to a baker's daughter from St. Louis, Missouri. Her name was Louisa. They would have 4 kids. Unfortunately, only 2 of those kids would live to adulthood to have their own children. Again, tragedy strikes in the frontier. He would lose 2 of his children at young ages. But those 2 that would survive, Arda was his oldest daughter, Irma was his youngest daughter, and they would travel with him during his show days. Louisa, though, she would stay back home. She watched the ranch. She made sure their assets were taken care of. They did attempt to divorce twice because it was not always a happy marriage. Part of it might have had something to do with the fact that Cody was constantly on the road and in Europe for 3 years at a time, leaving Louisa on her own. But luckily for Cody, Louisa actually saves his bacon at the end because, unfortunately, despite all of his success, despite his fame, Cody did make some questionable business deals and he would go bankrupt in 1913. But Louisa was doing some financial savvy tricks and whatnot, and she was investing money that he would send to her. Originally, the idea was he told her to invest in land and stock and any other type of assets, and she would. The only thing that she did, though, was that she put it all in her name alone. So she did not put his name on anything, which really saltified Cody. He was not happy with that. So that was one of the reasons he did take her to court to try and divorce, because she was, I don't know, not representing himself or herself well. In reality, the judge kind of was like, get over yourself, make up, it's fine. And that would come in handy. Her desire to put stuff only in her name came in handy when he went bankrupt, because creditors could not come for any of the assets that were just in her name. They could only come for his stuff. So Cody, is thought to have died destitute when he passes away. In reality, he just died with a lot less money than he could have, but he was still very wealthy, partially because of a very smart wife. Anyway, I could go on. I'm a big Louisa fan.
Great. That's perfect. That's great. And you know what? This always encourages people to read a book. And you always recommend books for us. I
do. And actually, Louisa wrote her own biography. Actually, a few years after Cody passes away, she would work with a publisher and write her side of the Buffalo Bills Wild West story, which is very fascinating. You can find a few old copies online, or if you just visit our codyarchives.org, you can actually read the whole autobiography collection from Cody, from Louisa, from some of his sisters. It's really fascinating. It's really funny because half of them disagree with each other, so we're not actually 100% sure what happened at certain times in their life. But there's a lot of really cool books. But I really enjoy Louisa's story just because it's a woman's opinion, a woman's view, and what would have been a very male-dominated time period.
All right, and I just shared the Cody archive in the chat if anybody's interested.
Cool. Thank you. We appreciate that.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, so any other questions?
Yep, we have a question. So you
Cool.
mentioned that Buffalo Bill will go to Europe for years at a time. In his inaugural trip, was that the first time Europe was really introduced to the Wild West of America?
Yes and no. There were a few other big names that would talk about the Wild West. You had painters who would go west, George Catlin, Albert Bierstadt, some of those big Western painters would be painting the West and bring their artwork to places like Paris and London, and they would showcase their images. And George Catlin would go one step further, and George Catlin, the painter, would actually hire Native Americans that he would have painted to travel with him over to Europe to be part of his kind of studio display. So Cody was not the first person to really introduce the West to European audiences, which worked really well for him because that meant they already had a taste for it. There was already a demand for more American West stuff. So he could capitalize on that existing demand. And he did. It was spectacular. The poster that looks exactly like this one to its right, my left, was the poster he would use in France. And I cannot speak French, but this says I am coming. And so Cody would be able to use images the Europeans were already familiar with, the buffalo, the cowboy. And he would say, you're not just looking at a static painting anymore. You're going to be watching American cowboys actually chase buffalo. You're going to be watching the Native Americans do a sun dance. So he was really able to capitalize on an existing demand that was already in Europe. And they loved it. They still love it. There are people that come here and visit the Buffalo Bill Center of the West from all over the world, but especially France and Germany. It's very fascinating. They might not speak a lick of English, but they all can say Buffalo Bill, which I find very fascinating.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So, two very identical posters, two very different audiences. One is the American audience, one is the French audience. And he wouldn't just use different languages to appeal to different audiences. He would also change the actual scenes and things he would show in his arena, depending on what cultures he was performing for. So if we want, we're going to head kind of down the area. This is our temporary exhibit space underneath the main Buffalo Bill Museum. And some of these posters are huge. They're 8 feet tall. Some of them are much smaller to go on telephone poles. And then we even have some posters that are 30 feet wide and 15 feet tall, because Cody would have all the sizes pretty much. And this is this is a picture. This is from our photograph archives. And this is a city in the background. And then you can see there's just a wall here that Buffalo Bill's marketing team would just plaster up posters, because paper and ink was relatively cheap. So you can just stick it on there, forget about it, which is usually what happened. Even today, posters are discovered as people are renovating old buildings and tearing off walls. They'll find posters of Buffalo Bill shows, Barnum and Bailey shows, Ringley Circus shows, because nobody thought to take them down, which I think
We're
is
heading back
fun.
to the Barnum Museum in the beginning of the new year.
Very cool. So they have, the printing companies that we've talked about, especially Calhoun Printing, they actually were tapped by Cody's group to print their posters because Barnum and Bailey originally used them to promote their stuff. So there was a lot of overlap between companies that would post and create prints and promotional materials. So you might see some very similar illustrative styles between our posters of Buffalo Bill and some of the Barnum and Bailey or Ringling Brothers, which I think is very interesting.
Is there any documentation of the printing companies?
There are a few around. Some of the biggest problem is that a lot of these printing companies existed in deeply industrial cities, Springfield, Massachusetts, New Haven, Connecticut, and a lot of those cities have lost that industrial history. So a lot of that has just been disappeared or goes into state archives. So there is some historical references and collections out there. We don't necessarily have a lot of those connections except the products that they created. Mm-hmm. But most of these companies are going to be in the big cities out east or down in Denver, actually. There was a few printing presses down there that would help with the Western promotional trails. So,
thank you.
Good question. Okay. Any other questions real quick?
No, you're safe. Go for it.
Okay. Otherwise, I'm actually going to turn this over to Nick because he really enjoys the two posters behind me. And I want him to be able to chat with you guys about the differences in how Buffalo Bill would promote to the various cultures. So if you bear with us as we shake the camera up a little bit.
Cool. Yes. not only did Buffalo Bill use his posters to market to different people via their languages, like we saw with those two posters back there, where one said "I am coming," the other said "Je viens," French versus English. He would sometimes subtly change the posters as well to market to different crowds, because different crowds would find different things appealing. The two posters behind me are really neat for that. This one here on my right is an English language poster, Buffalo Bill reviewing the Rough Riders of the world, and there's a whole big slew of flags. This is for an English-speaking audience, so you have the British flag displayed very prominently in the middle of the poster, along with all the other flags, and notably as well two American flags, one of which is being carried notably by a very Rough Rider-looking chap himself there. This poster is really interesting because this poster is a design that gets reused. He reuses this design further on when he travels to France, but the French aren't going to necessarily want to have the British displayed, prominently right in the middle of their posters. So when he takes this design and takes his show across the channel to French, he actually ends up redesigning the poster ever so slightly. So you'll know, instead of a big British flag emblazoned here right in the middle, the British have been moved kind of off to the side, and the French have been placed right in the middle. This is something he would do regularly with a lot of his posters. He'd tweak them ever so slightly so they were tailored to the proper crowds he was going to go see. He might just change up the wording of the language, or in this case, he might even shuffle around some flags. And it shows a really, really unique level of business savvy, because if you were just, traveling to these different countries, you could just change the language, and that would probably be enough, especially with someone as famous as Buffalo Bill. But he knew his audiences well enough that he knew, well, if I move the flags around and put the French cavalrymen in front instead of the English cavalrymen, that might sell me an extra, few dozen tickets in this French town, versus if they walk by and happen to see a British man right in the middle of their poster. And it's those little things, those little tweaks that would make Buffalo Bill one of the most popular and famous showmen of his day. That would put him head and shoulders above the rest.
Nick, you mentioned you use the same phrase that I've been talking to Darren about for decades. Know your audience, and apparently he knew his audience.
Oh yeah, no, Buffalo Bill was consummate about knowing his audiences and knowing how to cater to them. And I think that just came with just the amount of experience he had. He was on the road as a showman in the arena shows for almost 30 years, and he was doing stage shows before that. After a certain point, you get so much knowledge of where you're going to be catering to and who you're going to be catering to that you can just really smoothly and naturally shift your audience marketing around to those different groups.
Wonderful. I love that he changes his flag. Brilliant marketing.
There you go. Yep. So Cody wouldn't just change his promotional material either. He would actually change up what acts he would include in his show, which I think is even more fascinating in some senses. So one of the acts, or a lot of the acts again in his show, are going to be reenactments of battles out west. This was a different time period. My intern this last summer told me very interestingly, the history is a different country. So you can't go into the history and expect the same cultural practices that we have today, the same societal practices we have today. So a lot of Cody's promotional materials very much show the stereotypes, show the prejudices of the time, even though Cody himself was actually a really fascinating early advocate for conservation of buffalo, for women's right to vote. He was also a huge proponent of Native Americans' right to citizenship, which most Native Americans were not considered citizens of the United States until 1923. But Cody had been posting and advocating for that since the 1870s, even as he was fighting the Native Americans. So it's really fascinating. Cody is a very complicated guy, and you can see some of that come out in his promotional materials and what scenes that he would showcase in his arena. But one of the really interesting things that he would change would be the acts. So he would perform 2 or 3 times a day during his show season. He would have a morning show, an afternoon show, and then usually an evening or a night show. especially after he partnered with Thomas Edison to figure out how to illuminate his showgrounds. So he would figure out if the first morning show was a success, he would keep those acts and keep those scenes going. If the first morning show happened to flop and people didn't like it and there was boos and things like that, he could pivot really quickly. And he would do this especially for his international audiences, where the British might really, really enjoy hearing about Buffalo Bill's retelling of the Custer's last stand at the Battle of Little Bighorn. The British might really enjoy that, whereas the Italians, maybe not so much. Maybe they didn't necessarily like showing or seeing the Massacre of Custer, Massacre of Cowboys. Or another example, I don't know if we have any posters, not on this side, was Buffalo Bill. The British would eat up the stories of buffalo hunts. And Buffalo Bill would travel with an entire herd of buffalo that he would use in his show. And so when he was in Britain, what he would do is he'd have fake buffalo hunts where they stampede around the arena. You'd have cowboys hunting the buffalo and stampeding them back behind the scenes. British loved it. Whereas the audiences in Barcelona, Spain, it wasn't that impressive because they did running the bulls every year. They ran with actual bulls. So the idea of a fake buffalo hunt was like, this is really lame. So Cody would pivot and he would take the buffalo hunt out and he would add maybe the story of having to capture a horse thief in the Wild West, which apparently was really big because the Spanish really liked their horses. And the idea of stealing a horse was like the worst crime you could do. So it was really interesting how Buffalo Bill pivoted with even his promotional stuff as much as his acts in his show.
Carson, did he have a team? Did he have a team of advisors? He's reminding me of a Walt Disney at this point. Did he have people working under him that would give him suggestions? This didn't work. This did work.
Yes. So Cody was a really interesting guy in the sense that he had several direct partners. And an unsung hero that people don't really know about is a man named John Burke. John Burke was Buffalo Bill's promotional marketing director before there was such a thing as a PR department. And he himself deserves an entire exhibit and history book written about him because he was so revolutionary on how to expose news and how to share news. But John Burke would very much be the guy who would go and send forward teams to scout out potential showgrounds, potential cities to show in. And they would do what we would consider almost visitor studies. They would ask people, what are you looking forward to? What are you not looking forward to? And so he would be able to bring that back to Cody and Cody's other partner, Nate Salisbury, or his later partner, James Bailey, and be able to say, okay, this is the feedback we've got. This is what they're excited about. Let's feature, the attack on Custer. Let's feature the pioneer going west, and let's ignore the buffalo hunting. So he would take feedback a lot, and he would have a whole group of people that would be able to give him advice. Whether he followed the advice is the question. Most often he did, because he was, as much as he liked himself and he liked being the center of attention, he would also acknowledge other people's experiences. And that's actually probably one of the reasons he was so successful, is that he would listen to the cowboys or the military veterans or the Native Americans and people that he would be hiring, as he would take them and their feelings into consideration as he went through his show. That was why he was so successful for 30 years, as he really was kind of an egalitarian leader, and people appreciated that. He also made sure he was well paid.
Yeah, John's name is John Burr or John Burke?
Burke, Burke, John Burke.
And is he mentioned in any of the biographies about Cody?
He is. John Burke is even more interesting. He actually was one of Cody's original, when he was still a stage actor, person that he would involve in his theater combination, which is fascinating. So John Burke and Cody go back all the way to the 1870s, and John Burke would stay with Cody through the bankruptcies, through the divorce things, through almost anything. He was truly not only a devoted business partner, but a devoted friend, probably one of Buffalo Bill's best friends based on by our writings and readings about him. So he is mentioned. It's just he's kind of mentioned always secondary, which is a little tragic, because without what he did, without what Burke did, Cody probably would not have been the most famous man on earth. But that just leaves more job security for historians to find out more and write more, I guess you could say.
Speaking of job security, were all performers paid?
Yes, so it was really fascinating. Cody would make sure that any person featured in the play or in the arena, whether you were a Native American, a woman, horses even were taken really well care of, you would get a paycheck. He would go one step further, and because a lot of these Native Americans were coming off the reservation. This is the reservation period where people are being forced to live and stay on reservations. You cannot leave them without a sponsorship from somebody off the reservation. Like I said, they weren't considered citizens, so there was no freedom of movement. Cody would actually work with a lot of Native American leaders, including people like Sitting Bull, to pretty much facilitate young men, usually young, well, who would be warriors pretty much, to leave the reservation, participate in Buffalo Bill shows, see the world, be able to practice their culture during a time when the reservations were saying, no, you cannot live in teepees, you cannot do your sun dances, you cannot have horses or hunt buffalo. Whereas Cody was like, yeah, come work for me. Not only will you be able to do all of that, but I'll pay you for it. Oh, you want to bring your family too? Bring them along. They don't have to do anything except just travel with us. So Cody was really interesting in the sense that he would also supplement and even provide stipends for families to travel with the show performers and crew. So people were well paid and well fed. So, which is really, if you're a manager, those are two very important things. Give them money and give them food, and they're usually happy.
And we're almost out of time. One last question. We've had a lot of discussions about hunting buffalo scenes and shows. At this time, did they have blank ammunition?
So yeah, kinda. That you can load a cartridge with wooden bullets. Pretty much is what they would do. Those were the practice or training cartridges. In this time period, before OSHA was a thing, before stage safety was a thing, they would be using real firearms, which is a really interesting thing for our safety-minded society today. But what they would do to kind of prevent potential issues is they would use really low loads, or I'm looking for a word.
Yeah, just low green. It would very not much gunpowder.
Yeah, so they would do that. Cody himself, and I don't know if I have a good picture of Cody using his long rifles. So he would have long guns that would be his target rifles. So they wouldn't have a single projectile in those rifles. They would treat them almost as mini shotguns. So they would have small shot loads, which don't go nearly as far as, say, a rifle bullet would go. So they would adapt some of their show tools, their firearms especially, to make sure that they were trying to be as safe as they could. They would also make sure that the arena itself was a horseshoe shaped. So there was always a kind of open end where they would shoot and target all of the firearms as best they could if they were shooting with live ammo rather than the wooden bullets or blanks. So they did have safety in mind. And actually, the only gunshot injury related to Buffalo Bill's Wild West happened when he was a stage actor. And I think he actually, unfortunately, his gun went off and it had a bullet, and it actually hit the leg of a young audience member who was fine, and then got a pen pal for life because Cody was bereft with grief like that he could have hurt an audience member. So that's the only injury that we know of, despite the fact that firearms are very much a constant presence in all of Buffalo Bill shows.
And the sound must have been deafening with having all these guns going off at the same time.
That is something I've wondered about, because if you think about it, these people aren't really concerned with hearing loss. They're not really concerned with the noises. So the bright side is the low light or the low loads. There's a word for it. The low grain loads are going to be a little quieter. We're also working with a lot of black powder, which is not nearly as loud as our smokeless powder guns are today. So there's a little difference in volume already. But yeah, these are not quiet shows, whether it's the Native Americans doing their yells, whether it's the soldiers, the horses are screaming and things like that. These were not quiet shows. And then at the same time, you also had a cowboy band performing, which was all the percussion instruments, the brass instruments. Nobody was sleeping next door to the show.
Muzzle loader? Is that the word you're looking for?
Muzzle loader just refers to how the gun is loaded, which muzzle loaders usually are a little quieter just because they're not nearly, they don't have the same powder and the same loads. And they would use muzzle loaders in these performances just because those were some of the classic Western guns. But most of these guns, they're going to be what we call the breech loaders and repeating rifles or repeating guns. So they wouldn't have to stop in the middle of the show and reload. So, yeah.
Well, let's show everybody where they can learn more, because even after seven visits, there is still more to discover. At the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, you can follow them along on Facebook. I can't even click the like button because we clicked it so long ago. You can follow along on Instagram. Here we go. Ooh, we have this one still available. There we go. You can follow there. Instagram. Wonderful. Also, they are on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. Click that button on YouTube. Lots of videos here. Wow. You see the diversity of content that's available, which is wonderful. And look at you being all hip and new on TikTok as well. So if anybody's on TikTok, you can subscribe and watch and enjoy some shorts on there. We have the Cody Archive. It's codyarchive.org, as well as the shop. Support the museum. They certainly deserve our support with so much to offer and so many endeavors that they are pursuing and protecting. It certainly is a great way to show our support. And the holidays will be coming up soon. So looking here at some wonderful, wonderful ornaments here. All right. And lastly, centerofthewest.org. Head over there, plan your trip to Cody, Wyoming. And how many days do you think? You need 2 days at least? Maybe 3?
Admission gives you 2 days right off the bat, and they don't have to be consecutive. So you can plan, 1 day at the museum, maybe go into the park and then come back, explore the rest of the town. So we give you 2 days at minimum. We have seen people do it in less, but most people, they'll leave saying, I still haven't seen it all after being there for 2 days.
Yeah. No, take your time. Enjoy it. You can follow Celebrity Museums at celebritymuseums.com, as well as on YouTube. We're over here. We are on Facebook, of course. We're live on Facebook. Hello, everybody. We're on Instagram as well. And we're on X almost every day. What are we talking about today, Pop?
Oh, it's just a great picture of Roy Rogers and Martin and Lewis and Jane Russell from motion picture called Son of Paleface. The only person missing is the star of the movie, Bob Hope.
Wow. Oh, and Trigger. And Trigger's there. CelebrityMuseums.com. Our next program, we are heading across the pond to return with one of our friends for the holidays, the Phil Silvers Museum. This was a very early program. We also had spent some time with him during the Salathon. And wonderful.
It's in Covington, England, just so you know.
Yep. Wonderful program and a lot of fun. That's next week. We also have the Making of King Kong. Pop, you're looking forward to the Spam Museum next month.
Oh, yeah.
And lots of other things. Oh, and there's Barnum. We were talking about visiting Barnum. He will be our first 2025 virtual road trip. 2025.
I am still amazed that we're still doing this, Darren.
We are still cooking. We'll have all these links heading over to you later in the week with a follow-up email. So thank you.
I hate to say this and put you on the spot, but somehow I feel, Darren, after 7 visits, we should have a page just with all 7 trips, because they're all so different. They're all different. Every time we visit with her, she finds a new part of the museum we have not explored.
Can we do a director's cut? What do you think? Like just a 7-hour virtual road trip?
There you go.
All right, Kirsten.
We're always up for anything. Just saying.
Okay.
Thank you both
again.
so much.
Hey,
this
have
was
a
wonderful.
great holiday. And this is a pre-holiday show, but thank you so much. You've really, really surpassed yourself. You always do. And thank you.
Well, thank you.
It was your first time out of the gate. Thank you, Nick. We really appreciate you. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and we will see you next Monday. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye, all.
Bye.